Live from Sydney, the ABC's Lateline. Here's Kerry O'Brien.
Welcome to Lateline, a program that promises something new in Australian television.
Good evening, welcome to Lateline. I'm Maxine McHugh.
I'm Virginia Trioli.
I'm Ali Moore.
I'm Lee Sales.
I'm Tony Jones.
And I'm Emma Alberici. Welcome to the final episode of Lateline. I've been sitting in the presenter's chair for the past 6 years, but the show's been a staple in the ABC's evening schedule for just shy of 3 decades. I've invited some friends to join me tonight to pay tribute to the important journalism that's been a hallmark of the Lateline brand. Welcome to you all. Maxine McHugh, Kerry O'Brien, Lee Sales, welcome. And apologies from Tony Jones, who is out of the country. What do you call a collective of presenters?
An ego of presenters?
No. Ego is not collective.
We're already off.
That's a contradiction in terms.
Small herd.
Kerry, you introduced this program in 1990 by promising viewers something different. What do you think made Lateline unique back then?
Well, apart from the fact that there'd been nothing like it on Australian television before, and there were several reasons or several factors involved in that. One was simply the way we used satellites to travel the world and trawl the best people, the best minds around the world who surprisingly were prepared to be available to speak to people on the other side of the world. But also because the ABC was prepared to invest the time in conversation. We were not defensive about talking head television, where a lot of people were and are still. This thought that you can't grab and sustain an audience unless you've got constant movement and you're constantly distracting them from one thing to another because oh my goodness, we can't possibly keep their minds concentrated on one thing for any length of time. So that was another element. But the fact that we had the freedom to choose between hard-edged programs, strong social programs, philosophical programs, and even sometimes have a little bit of fun. And the audience came with us, and they loved it too. And people were hooked because they were hungry for knowledge. They were hungry for intelligent conversation that explored the world.
And Emma, could I just add to that? I think what happened very, very quickly is that the word went out that Lateline was the go-to program for serious commentary. And throughout the 90s, if I look back on the 90s now, and I think actually compared with today, it was a period of hope and optimism. Certainly, you know, after we got through the recession we had to have and all the rest of it, you think internationally, you know, the wall had come down, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of apartheid. This was a hopeful moment in multilateral relations. There was the idea, if you had something serious to say, Lateline was the place to go to, because it had a precious thing that few other programs had. It had time. There was time for proper research, there was time for reflection, and time for serious discourse. The 90s nationally, I think, was the decade, you could say, of Keating and Howard. Both of them conviction politicians, both very, very different, but both prepared to argue their corner. And of course, they did that over and over on Lateline, didn't they?
Can I just hold you up there? Sorry to interrupt you, Kerry, but we will actually get to the debate around the way the media landscape's changed a little later. I want to stay with those early years first off and talk specifically about some of the stories that were the hallmark of that era. And Kerry, I guess the coup attempt against Gorbachev and Yeltsin stands out in those early years as one of the most memorable that you were involved in. Can you take us back to that night?
Well, we had one of the hardline plotters against Gorbachev and Yeltsin on the program from Moscow, a guy named Viktor Elksnis, who was the head of a very powerful bloc of hardline conservatives called Soyuz in the Supreme Soviet, and he said on the program, if Gorbachev does not come back to us, there will be a coup within the next few months. And this is what you're alluding to. We're back in Australia come August. Gorbachev is in his dacha on the dacha, however you pronounce it, on the Crimean coast, and suddenly there's a coup attempt. And we were on air as the old guard generals were in their cars driving to Moscow airport to fly down to the Crimea. It was their second attempt, actually. They were going back to Gorbachev to say, well, crunch point, come back and join us and sign the declaration of a state of emergency or your resignation. And he did neither. And at the same time, Yeltsin's in the parliament, the White House of Moscow, surrounded by tanks and about 10,000 people, which is not a lot. It's not a very big ring of protection. And in the old days, they'd have just been ploughed under. But because by then the world and a lot of citizens of Russia had got used to the idea of democracy, the old guard melted, the coup was over. And I think that because we were in the satellite age and the world was covering this as it was happening, and the pressure of world opinion coming back in on them was a part of deciding that outcome.
Extraordinary in the early days when we hadn't established ourselves yet.
Well, we were getting great talent right from the start, you know.
And I think that was a really defining thing of the show, because in this era when you guys were doing it, I was just a baby journalist starting out, and it was such
thanks for making
good...
that point, Lee. Oh, right.
It was such a good show. And I remember, you know, if I'd get in the lift and one of you would be in, I'd think, oh, it's Kerry O'Brien, you know, it's Maxine McHugh. But the thing that I think made that show so amazing in that era, and I sort of mourned a bit when they changed format away from the one-issue show, because I thought it just worked so well. It was the fact that the show always went for the top-level talent that you could get. They weren't looking for just some commentator. They were looking for the type of people you just described, which were absolute players. And so if you were watching Lateline, you know, any night, you'd be guaranteed that you'd be getting people who were either players or they had been players until very recently and had then stepped aside. And I think that that culture carried right through Lateline, that you weren't looking for sort of B-grade people just, you know, banging on with their opinions. You were looking for the best people that you could get your hands on around the world.
That's just a given, Lee. I mean, that's a given. That's what you do.
The battle for perestroika is being fought out behind these Kremlin walls in the President's office and the Supreme Soviet.
How long do you think it will take before Mr. Gorbachev does go?
Ну, это все зависит, в первую очередь, от Горбачева. То событие это ожидает нас в ближайшие пару месяцев.
А я мог бы его очень просто, самое большее направить в Австралию послом, а то какую-нибудь Гвинею-Бисау. И вот он бы там сидел на другом континенте, и так бы, и все забыли о Ельцине. Я считал, что это неприемлемо было бы для меня, человека, которому стал на реформы, на демократизацию страны, партии, так обращаться со своим коллегой, партнером.
And yet, there are many who would say that it was Yeltsin's courage that saved you in that August coup.
Здесь он проявил мужество. Больше того, я думаю, что меньше всего он думал о Горбачеве, а думал о себе.
Maxine, I wanted to get to one of your most memorable moments on the program in those early years, and that was, of course, when you interviewed Aung San Suu Kyi when she was under house arrest. How on earth did you manage that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it wasn't a case of sort of turning up one morning for the morning conference and say, hey, let's go to Burma tonight. You know, that was weeks in the planning, if not a bit more, actually, in the execution. This was at a time, I think the interview was about 96, 97, and Aung San Suu Kyi had been under house arrest since 1990. She had come to incredible prominence during the 89 riots, got the Nobel Peace Prize in 91. So by this stage, she's attracting huge international attention. There's immense sympathy for her because her family's in England. She's afraid to leave the country because she doesn't think that the regime will allow her back. And she's got that beautiful, sort of almost angelic, delicate demeanour, that beautiful voice. What we couldn't do, obviously, is organise a live satellite out of there. We got a crew to her residence, and I'm pretty sure actually the tape was flown out, let's say to Singapore or something like that. And that had to do with kind of not contaminating the material, but I'm sure the Burmese officials would have been all over. She was watched at every moment, so I don't think she would have been very careful in a sense about what she said, but she was certainly making her case for democracy in Burma, Myanmar. We look around the region and in recent history,
in the Philippines. It took something like a very frustrated middle class that was fed up with corruption, and in the end, of course, the Marcos regime collapsed. Can you see something similar happening in Burma? Do those sort of preconditions exist?
Well, Burma is not the Philippines, but I think one can say that there is a lot of frustration building up in this country. And whenever frustration builds up at that rate, it is never good for the future.
Can there be a peaceful transition to democracy, do you think?
I think we can bring about a peaceful transition if all of us are interested enough in bringing about one.
What about the position of the Australian government? I'm interested in your view on that. Of course, our policy says that economic sanctions would not be effective against this law, and it maintains a policy of neither encouraging nor discouraging investment in Burma. Does the neutrality of this position worry you somewhat?
Well, I think that sitting on the fence must be an extremely uncomfortable position, and I myself have never been in favour of such a very precarious stand, or I should perhaps say sit, as it were.
Now, what I recall from that time, I am pretty sure I never asked her the question I would ask her now. What is your concept of respect for religious tolerance and the wider pluralism? We now have a semblance of democracy in Myanmar. They have elections, but quite frankly, it's illiberal democracy. And we have seen the shame and the disgrace of what has happened to the Rohingya.
Lee, like me, you were a foreign correspondent before you took the chair on Lateline. You were in Washington, and in fact, you went back to the United States to do an interview with Henry Kissinger.
Yeah, one of the things that I absolutely loved about Lateline, so I had been US correspondent just after 9/11, and I got back in 2006, and then I came into Lateline in 2007. The time slot for Lateline, so it was at 10:30 p.m, although it sort of wiggled around a little bit around that. It always floated a bit.
Did it ever?
It was, I know. The strength of it was that you pretty much had the international terrain to yourself, because 7:30 was too early in the evening. London had only sort of just come online. Americans were asleep still. But the 10:30 p.m. slot, it was first thing in the morning in the United States, and London had by then been awake. You know, it'd be sort of early afternoon. So you really had the pick of the sort of Northern Hemisphere talent to yourself. And so that was, for me, particularly because I had just come back from overseas, I always wanted to be trying to do as much international coverage as we possibly could. And it was a really amazing time. I mean, it's always an amazing time in American politics, but it was when, you know, it was apparent that the invasion of Iraq had been, you know, disastrous, and Afghanistan was falling apart. The Bush administration was really sort of limping to its conclusion. Hillary Clinton seemed a lock on the Democrat nomination for the presidency in 2008, and then all of a sudden this Barack Obama shows up on the scene. And so we were doing a lot of American coverage. The reason that Henry Kissinger and going to the US to do that interview, and we did some other people there, sticks in my mind, is not so much because of the interview, it's because I travelled with the then executive producer of Lateline, who was John Bruce. And people watching at home, you know, see us as the faces of the show, but there's such an incredible team of people who work behind it, and I can't really think about working at Lateline without thinking of the contribution that some of those people made. Rob Dormer, who's the long-time director of the show, who I'd hear every night in my ear. And John Bruce had this unbelievable memory for international affairs, but also federal politics. And so one of the highlights of my day would be if we had you know, a politician, or it was a Friday night we had a panel, would be, I'd do all my research and thinking about it, and I'd go and sit down with John for half an hour, and we'd sort of throw ideas back and forth. And John would always say, you know, it reminds me of 94 when blah, blah, blah. He'd always throw out some fantastic...
I remember.
Yeah, that's right. And so he could give you this, and again, I think that's the difference with Lateline to a lot of programs that are out there. It was the sort of depth that you could bring to it. Also because you had, you know, know, the 15 minutes or so to work with the interview. I remember when I came to 7:30, Kerry said to me, "You're about to discover there's a big difference between a 15-minute interview and, you know, a 7 or 8 minute interview."
Absolutely.
And they're just worlds apart in terms of the skills that are
But
involved.
it's that historical context that John Bruce gave to everything you were doing.
Yeah.
It gave you that extra dimension, extra layer to the interview you're about to do.
And also, I think the other thing with, you know, John and Rob and the people behind the scenes, Mick, the floor manager, it's that often because you'd be going overseas, and particularly so when you guys were doing it where you'd have the 3 guests, the technology, the potential for things to mess up was just absolutely epic. And so when you come into the studio and you're sort of live, when I heard the music before, I felt slightly anxious because of the feeling of when you'd be sitting in there and hear it go. And some nights it would start and it would be, well, we haven't established the comms yet to Afghanistan. We haven't established the comms to wherever. And so you're out there on the high wire thinking, well, geez, I hope I get this happening.
But didn't you think the people came along with you? I mean, I think that was a part of the appeal of the program. People actually could understand that you were on something of a high wire.
Yeah.
And there was an element of unpredictability to it, and that just added to the magic of live, I think.
Collectively, we've interviewed everyone from politicians to philosophers, authors, entertainers, even a drag queen. But above all else, the show made a name as the place that attracted some of the world's most significant figures.
We have never been soft. We have never been lenient.
One of my colleagues said, "What you want is consensus." I said, "I don't understand consensus. I understand agreement. What is consensus?"
You know, I've learned the hard way that peace is not poetry.
Well, I certainly want the Labour Party to be a radical reforming government.
The President is committed to Iraq because Iraq is critical to our security.
Russia is never easy to deal with, but I think there's an underlying need to build it into the international system.
The arms we are selling to Syria, they are not used against demonstrators. Those are arms to protect Syria.
And I was asked many questions by Jordanians that were getting just as frustrated seeing that 20% of their country are now Syrian refugees.
All right, Mr. Howard, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks for joining us tonight on Lateline.
Thank you.
Following that interview, and after Vice Admiral Shackleton, the Chief of the Navy, put out a statement attempting to clarify his earlier remarks, Mr. Howard requested a second interview with Lateline on the issue. Who was it that convinced Admiral Shackleton to make this new statement?
I think that's a bit offensive to him.
But even your own party polling is bad news for you, isn't it?
What do you know about our party polling that I don't know?
Maxine, I don't think that has got anything to do with my talking about what Mr. Howard said tonight.
It's central to the message.
I think you were drifting off here with these questions that you're asking me.
All right, Tony, but on another matter, have you met Archbishop Pell during the election campaign?
Not that I can recall.
Not that you can recall, because we believe that you've had at least one meeting with him quite recently.
Well,
you don't recall that? At the Presbytery in Sydney?
Actually, now that you mention it, I did meet with Cardinal Pell. So what? Why shouldn't I meet with Cardinal Pell?
Countries are being destroyed.
You are clearly
homes.
obfuscating, and I did not invite you onto this program.
I reject the accusation.
Tell us what happened behind the scenes in this move against Kevin Rudd. People are going to be writing political PhDs on this subject.
Well, I don't know about that, but I mean, I had a normal day at work today.
Why is it that the United States, this little backward agrarian country with 3 million people, should have produced in the 18th century 3 of the great intellectual geniuses of the 18th century?
Not all of you, not all of the parts of you are going to die because the printed words you leave behind constitute a form of immortality.
Litera scriptura manet, the written word will remain. That's true, but it won't be that much comfort.
You know, watching that clip, I know you're running the discussion, Emma, but what do you...
Are you sure you know that?
Just allow me to take over for a moment. What do you think are your more memorable interviews? I mean, there's a difference between favourite and memorable.
Yeah, it's a bit vexed talking about favourite, but in that clip there, you would have seen Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, just after I got back from my 4 years as Europe correspondent in London. It was January 2012. And he was in the first month in Australia and had sort of one day in Sydney and decided to do one interview, and we were lucky enough he granted it to LATELINE. And he did want to talk about the Australia-Russian relationship, and of course all I wanted to talk about was Syria, because this was only 10 months in to the civil war. We had something like 5,000 civilian deaths, and the conversation was already moving to Russia's role and its support of Assad. And so, you know, we didn't know very much then, other than, quite obviously, the disgrace of a president turning his military onto the people. And so that's where I was going with the interview. And in hindsight, when you listen to what Sergei Lavrov had to say in early 2012 about the role of the international community in that war, it's incredibly prescient, because he said we need to learn the lessons of Libya. He said we were so fixed on removing Gaddafi, we paid scant regard for what came in its place. And look at the chaos that has ensued. That's what he was saying to us. He said, isolating Bashar al-Assad is never going to be the answer. It's never going to bring peace to Syria, and it's potentially going to erupt into a much greater calamity throughout that region. And hasn't that proven to be exactly the fallout?
And Colin Powell said that America should and had learnt the lessons of Vietnam. And there he was, standing up in the United Nations with false information as an excuse and a pretext for going into Iraq, which became the greatest foreign policy disaster in American history. So much for learning the lessons of history.
Yeah, absolutely. Maxine McHugh, we saw in that video there the interview you did with Pauline Hanson, which you recently said in hindsight that you wished you'd showed her a little more civility. What happened?
I'm a bit bored talking about this, but anyway, look, I'll go, because I have revisited this a number of times. It's remarkable, of course, isn't it? We're seeing Hanson too 20 years later. But that was 1998, so I secured the first major interview with her. She didn't respect any of the rules. In fact, that's what those who voted for her, that's what they liked about her. And I think that's probably what we in the mainstream press did not sufficiently appreciate at the time. And certainly Kerry had, the program had a set of expectations. It was produced on a set of expectations that if you came on this show at 10:30 at night to talk for 20 minutes, then you had something to say, you had something to say of substance, and it could withstand a bit of interrogation. I had those expectations of Pauline Hanson, so I have to say it was a genuine shock to me that she fell so far below that bar. But it was the beginning of a convention-busting period, which I think we're still living through. We get shock after shock.
Kerry, recently the creator of Newsnight at the BBC wrote a piece where he was bemoaning the death of the political interview. He said, on the one hand, you've got politicians who have become exceptionally good at not saying anything of substance, and that has led to interviewers who just go for the jugular to avoid what he called boring, snoring TV.
Well, I reject the fear of boring, snoring TV. I think the greater issue is that if that's what the interview is going to be, the interviewer trying to get anything of substance and the political interviewee doing everything in his or her power not to answer questions, and in the process not just to show a complete lack of respect to the interviewer but more importantly to the audience. The issue isn't that it's boring and snoring. The issue is that it is a fundamental contempt for one of the key elements of democracy. which is a vibrant media, and which is a part of the process of keeping the people who hold the power honest. And so I mean, look, if you are delivering boring, snoring television, then you'll pay the price yourself as a program, as an individual. But the balance that you have to walk in this day and age, and I haven't done it for a couple of years now, but the balance you have to walk is between allowing the guest in the studio, if it's a straight one-on-one interview, the opportunity to provide answers, but at the same time to try and keep them honest. And if you've got to squeeze that into 7 or 8 or 9 minutes, then more often than not you're not going to do it. And if the interviewee is skillful enough, as some are, they will actually try and persuade the audience that you're the one who's being rude and abrasive and disrespectful of the guest and the audience, when in fact it is them.
And I think one of the key things is the point that Kerry made about the contempt for the audience. And one of the things that I find quite baffling is when I approach the interview, I approach it exactly as Kerry just described. And I think that often the questions I ask are quite basic and reasonable, because I try to think, what would the average reasonable person watching at home like to know about this? And I try to give the person the opportunity to address concerns that ordinary people might have, or criticisms that ordinary people might have. And so I think you, politician, you're in the business of trying to persuade people to vote for you. So if you can't engage on basic sort of points that I think are fairly reasonable, what hope do you have of persuading people who might be fence-sitting or even in the opposing camp to come across? And I think there's been very few times probably in the past, 10 years of my career, or even close to the past 20 really, where I've actually felt persuaded by the argument that somebody has made.
Can I just pick up on that? The political players are actually no longer in the advocacy business for the most part. I think the attitude among many is, how do I sit here for 7 minutes and make as few mistakes as possible and few headlines?
No, but and get out of I think you're being too kind.
No, but hang on, because I'll tell you what I noticed when I got to Canberra as a political player.
That's what I was going to say. You've seen it from both sides, and I was curious to know from you.
Okay, I walk in after
whether it's
30 year.
Sorry, Maxine. Whether it's more the cause of the journalists, the change in this dynamic, or the politicians.
Well, I walked into Canberra after 30 years as a journalist. On the other side, I go there as a political player, and it wasn't the ABC that everyone was trying to get on. It was Sky News to get on and do a bib and bub biff at 8:30 in the morning.
That's
and you know what all that was about?
Maxine.
That was all about, exactly. But that was where the focus was. That was all about impressing your colleagues and getting on this committee or whatever. People would be. I saw colleagues congratulated if they got one over their opponent at 8:30 in the morning on Sky.
Now we know
an audience of 15,000. This is a couple of thousand people.
The tiniest audience.
It is the smallest of bubbles, but I got to tell you, that was the focus. And people were less inclined to put themselves through the longer scrutiny of if you like, an ABC extended interview.
It wasn't just Sky that was being exploited by politicians. I can remember Alexander Downer's press secretary, Chris Kenny, actually acknowledging in print volunteering in print once, how the cycle worked and how they would often use Lateline to launch something new into the next day's news cycle. Now, that's fine, let them try, but if Alexander Downer was prepared to come on and have any one of you interview him for 15 or 20 minutes, then you've got a chance to keep the Alexander Downers honest. So at least it's a bit of a genuine playing field. Where they go through these other circuses, it's not. It's just performance territory.
There's also some media culpability in how things have evolved, and it's partly to do with because the business model's fallen out of commercial media, and a lot of space now is filled by fluff and opinion.
Partly because it's cheaper.
It's cheaper, exactly. It's cheaper we've got 24/7, internet news, and it needs to be filled. So I noticed, for example, to use the example of the first interview that Malcolm Turnbull did when he became Prime Minister, we did basically the whole 7:30. It was about a 21-minute interview with him. There was so much, looking at it as a journalist, I thought there was so much news in it. And for me, the thing that stuck out as the biggest news was that I asked him something like, what do you consider to be the biggest regional security threat? And he said China. And I thought that is extraordinary that the new Prime Minister has nominated China as the greatest threat. But the way the interview gets written up, it gets written up by every single time I do, Malcolm Turnbull or Bill Shorten, it's like, well, who landed the biggest punch on who? Did Lee Sales punch harder or did Malcolm Turnbull or whatever? And so it focuses a lot on the sort of dynamics of it because that's easy to write rather than the actual content of the interview.
And it's easier to distill in 140 characters as well.
Yeah, and so I think that there is a media
but actually, I have to say,
culpability
if Turnbull had continued as he started, because he looked pretty good in that first 24 hours.
There's a rabbit hole we're not going down.
I thought he might have broken the cycle, but he didn't.
So, Lateline has been responsible for breaking countless important stories, including 4 years ago when our work on the institutional responses to child sexual abuse became one of the triggers for the Royal Commission.
Peter Fox also encountered alleged serious issues of cover-up in his investigation of Father Dennis McAlinden.
These priests were operating in adjoining parishes, abusing children. They were meeting at meetings together.
As I understand it, you're also ordered to stand down from the case, to no longer investigate this case. Is that a correct way of putting it?
That's absolutely correct. That's spot on.
Tonight, Australia's institutions and child sexual abuse. The Prime Minister announces a Royal Commission. You were the one calling for this Royal Commission last week. You must be feeling quite vindicated.
This is the end of my policing career. I realised that from the moment that I decided to speak out last week.
No one noticed the child was missing. All child sexual assault in Central Australia is happening at much higher rates than are currently being reported to police, as is violence on Aboriginal women and children.
The level of intervention here is quite dramatic and quite sweeping, and we shouldn't mince words. We are in effect supplanting the Northern Territory government.
Well, tonight a special Lateline investigation raises allegations that the church in Sydney was involved in covering up the sexual assault of an 11-year-old girl.
They told me that it was my fault because I'd been bad in a past life. I'd probably done something bad in a past life, so I pulled it in.
Not only was Carmen Rayner blamed for her abuse, she says she was told by a senior Scientologist to lie to police and community services about what her then stepfather, Robert Alexander Kerr, had done to her.
These vivid photographs show 86-year-old dementia patient Betty Daly, who was constantly injured in yet another New South Wales nursing home. Here's how life in a Victorian nursing home ended last year for Margaret McAvoy.
She was screaming in pain. And when I was leaving her on
It's the 1st of June last year in an isolation block in Curtin Detention Centre. Behind this reinforced door, 2 men have reached breaking point. Bloodied and dazed, this detainee pleads for someone to explain why he's been locked up. There's no answer. This photo of Vivian Solon was sent to Lateline by her family in the Philippines.
What about releasing a photograph of Vivian Young so that people in the Philippines might at least know what she looks like?
Well, I think we'll leave it to the professionals to do the job.
It's really a miracle. About 9 o'clock as I switched on the news and it was her case and they mentioned her name.
Maxine, you were the presenter during some of those investigations around the treatment of asylum seekers in the Curtin Detention Centre and with Vivian Solon. I wanted you to reflect, if you could, on the way the issue of asylum seekers has been reported over the past decade or so.
Can I just pick up first on some of the voices we heard there? Margot O'Neill, I think,
Susie
Smith, other. Again, just to the sort of the gravitas of Lateline, those programs were, again, a long time in the making. You don't get sort of those sort of admissions, revelations, you know, in an instant. So I just want to make the point that Lateline and a good cracking current affairs unit is such an important ecosystem. Everyone sees the job we do. We're supported by you know, executive producers. You talked about, you know, John Bruce before, Lee, but there were such layers of talent. And I think Lateline's effectiveness over the years, the fact that, you know, talent is drawn to talent, and Lateline has had that in spades. So you saw
and
some of
we've had,
those.
as presenters, we've had, well, in the earlier days, 2 producers finding talent around the world to come into our studios.
Yeah,
and,
absolutely. So all
locally, yes.
A foreign and a domestic.
Well, we used to. That's changed.
Yeah. So I just wanted to make that point that, you know, the depth of talent that Lateline has attracted over the years. But look, you ask about the reporting that, well, this is something that's dogged us since, certainly in a big way, since the Tampa. And it's been a very divisive issue for journalists to cover, divisive in the community and divisive in terms of the National Parliament. We're still living with that. And in terms of, and I also look at some of the clips there, and just in terms of our neglect of children, you can see the story of the 2 Australias in all of that. I mean, there's a debate in Victoria now about the age of criminality for children. We've had the horror stories of young people in a place like Parkville. I mean, Victoria, which prides itself on its progressive politics, is one of the highest incarceration states in the country. You know, we talk about the NT and all the rest of it. Here we are in 2017, and some of these basic social justice issues are plaguing us.
Look, it's interesting. It's interesting to me that you've got those 2 juxtaposed. You've got the sexual abuse involving substantially the church and other big institutions that we thought we trusted, and then you've got the intervention in the Northern Territory from the Howard government, based substantially around the allegations of child sexual abuse in Northern Territory Aboriginal communities.
The substantial work of Susie Smith, yeah.
And look, good journalism, more power to it, but I think we also carry a responsibility to go back and look at the effect of political outcomes. It's 10 years since intervention, 10 years. Now, look at the 2 ways that sexual abuse of children is treated. You had this massive intervention, you had fundamental human rights taken away from Aboriginals, you had the Racial Discrimination Act, which is really the thin legal line, the one thin legal line offering any kind of real protection against racism for Indigenous Australians. You had that abused with the introduction of intervention. You see, and I might add that 2 years later, the Australian Crime Commission came to the view that there was no pedophile ring in the Northern Territory, as was alleged and as the intervention was based on. You look at the difference in the way that child sexual abuse was used in that regard, the allegation of it, and the way it's dealt with in the white community, domestic violence. I would think you would find that the incidence of domestic violence in the rest of the Australian community away from Aboriginal communities is highly substantial. And yet 10 years after that intervention involving the military and all kinds of processes that were immensely demeaning of Aboriginal communities, it was as if the rot of pedophilia and drunkenness and abuse was pervasive right through every community in the Northern Territory. The intervention is still there. Well, if it worked, why is it still there? And where is the journalism that is challenging that?
Well, that was the question I was going to ask. And to you, Lee, I wonder what you think about where the media's responsibility starts and ends on a story like that, which was, you know, something that Lateline was at the forefront of.
Well, I think that, you know, it's exactly as Kerry said, there should be accountability. You know, when politicians say, oh, I'm going to do something, or, again, just to reference, as an example, that first interview with Malcolm Turnbull, in many interviews since, I've gone back to that and said, you said that when you started, you were going to be a free market government. You've just announced this policy that's a massive government intervention. How does that square with the sort of government you said you'd deliver? You know, something like the intervention, something like the intervention, or something that I've reported a lot on, say Guantanamo Bay, you said that you were setting up this facility and setting aside, fundamental principles of justice because it was necessary to keep the world safer from terrorism and to deliver terrorists to justice. How have the results actually measured against what you said was necessary at the start? Because often what happens when these sort of big sweeping policies come in is that fundamental rights are traded off. And so in the case of Guantanamo, you look at that and you think, well, it's achieved neither of those goals. The world's far less safe from terrorism than it was back in 2001. And there's still, tons of, well, not tons actually, there's dozens of people still there who've been held indefinitely without trial now for coming up to close to 20 years. So I think that we do have a responsibility to revisit these stories, and not just let them be little...
And it's interesting, isn't it, because there have never been more media outlets, if you like, never more people engaged in parlaying the news.
Oh,
anyone...
Emma. I mean,
no, but this is what I'm saying,
instances...
and yet there are issues as big as the one we've just talked about
that
is not being revisited in a substantive way.
But you've got a situation where there might be more journalists. In some instances, there are many fewer journalists, and overall, there are fewer journalists. But they're also being asked to do more. They're being far more thinly stretched. I mean, there are press releases going to air and appearing in newspapers virtually untouched, with little subbing marks around them.
Robots are being deployed to actually write them.
Yes, well, maybe in some instances, if the facts fit into them...
Don't say it.
No.
So are you pessimistic?
I'm joking, everyone.
Are you, Kerry, pessimistic about the future of journalism?
The bottom line is, it is the organisations and the individuals who have the resources who will still control the bulk of the output. So I think we're going through a period where quality is under challenge. We're going through a period where accuracy is under challenge. We're going through a period where we are far more open to cynical manipulation, and particularly in the way that software and algorithms can dictate, they can alter.
The players are going to different places. Now, we've seen a lot of examples tonight of, the top players knowing that they can come on Lateline and, that's where they strut their stuff. Just this week, Martin Parkinson, head of Prime Minister and Cabinet Officer, who once upon a time might have been lured on a program like Lateline, he did a half-an-hour interview on The Policy Shop, which is the podcast that's run out of the University of Melbourne by the Vice-Chancellor, Glyn Davis. Now, they know each other. Perhaps Parkinson went on there because he feels comfortable with someone like Glyn. But that podcast, coming out of a university, produced the lead story on The Guardian, because Parkinson talked to Davis and said, this is the legacy of what Abbott did. Abbott sacked me simply because I was doing my job, and this has been the escalating effect on the public service, right? Good interview.
Lee, when I was thinking about tonight, I was thinking, well, when Kerry started on the show, there was no internet. The phone was largely at home and stuck to the wall, and you watched the news at 6 or 7 o'clock at night, and if you missed it, you had to wait for the next round of news programs in the morning, and that was pretty much all the newspaper to be delivered. There was no catching up on Twitter or Facebook or anywhere else on a device. Damn. You had to watch things by appointment and schedule.
And I just didn't know what I was missing.
Lee, do you think it's better now?
Stop sounding like a dinosaur.
It's not better, it's different. There's lots of things about the current situation that fill me with pessimism and just despair sometimes, quite frankly, when I see certain, things that make news. But the thing that's exciting about it is that you can reach an audience that you could never reach previously. Like, say, for example, the New Yorker now, its audience would be, and the New York Times, when I was studying in journalism, if I wanted to see the New York Times, I had to go to the Brisbane State Library.
Yeah. Lee, I think that's a very good point. The New York Times, the Washington Post, the New Yorker have not bastardised or cannibalised their core products to create the online. They understand that you actually have to keep investing in the core content, and that content drives everything else they do.
And
I'm like you. I love having all those different platforms, but it comes from well-resourced newsrooms.
And it's something that I believe in very
lucky.
strongly
They've got
for
Jeff
the ABC.
Bezos there now.
I think for the
pouring the money
ABC,
in.
we need to, our core brand in you know, my crusty old bag view should be that we do quality, thorough, serious journalism. That should be the ABC's brand, and I think that we should absolutely jealously guard that, whether it is on air, online, whatever. And I think that, you know, that is what we need to be in there fighting for. That doesn't mean, I mean, I don't think that needs to be boring or staid, and I like having a laugh as much as the next person, but at the end of the day, I think there are some core responsibilities that the ABC has to meet that are very serious. Holding politicians to account is one of them. Covering international affairs is another one.
There has never been a more complex time in history as far as I am concerned. So, what is the role of the media in that time? It's a broad role. It's as important as it's ever been, probably more important than many other times in history. And you need time to reflect. You need to have access to the information. You need to have the great minds who are grappling with these things rather than politicians who are too scared to stick their heads above the parapet and acknowledge that they actually don't have answers on a number of these things.
Can I pick you up on that, actually, because Lateline was responsible for quite a key documentary branded Lateline just recently, where we looked at the AI race and the way that is changing the workforce, the way that is changing business, the way that is changing all our lives. Indeed, many academics are now saying that by the time the current crop are graduating from university, 60% of them will have studied for jobs that don't exist.
I did an interview with Nicholas Negroponte in the mid-90s, right, for Lateline. He was the big guru of MIT in Boston, and he's talking about the internet, and he's talking about email and all these sort of things. And at the end of the interview, he said, oh, look, I'll give you my email address. And he's saying, N Negroponte, you know, _ whatever. I had no idea how to write it. I was such a... I mean, Margot, where are you? I had no idea. I did not know what he was talking about.
Oh, well, I have a similar story at Channel 9, walking into an office I shared with another reporter and saying to her, do you know what Google is? Let me shift gears a little and bring some levity to the conversation. I want us to take a look at some of the funny and unexpected, perhaps unfortunate moments from the Lateline vault.
But first, Mark Corcoran reports from out there.
And we thank you, Christopher Hitchens, for being there. Can you hear me, Christopher Hitchens?
What? Can you please tell me what's happening, when I'm going to start and how long? And am I live or is this recorded?
This is live, but if you'd like to continue, we can right now. But you are saying the jury is out on the climate science, is that correct?
If the science was settled, Copernicus would be dead.
OK, Tony Abbott says the coalition will have a strong...
Sorry, he is dead. He is dead. He would have been killed.
It is the height of bad manners to interrupt. Please restrain yourself. And the figures that I have used are deduced from the chemistry of rocks which erupt on the sea floor.
And actually, it's the height of bad manners, Professor Plimer, to lie on national television about something that you know to be plain wrong.
I'd swim upstream in a river of shit with me mouth open just to see Peter Reith match compassion and sincerity in the same bloody place together.
You have no evidence that he didn't tell the truth.
Jared,
that's an outrageous allegation to me.
Jared, that's what the note is all about.
No, it's not. He may have forgotten.
No, Jared.
You're confused.
No, Jared. I think I was listening to the evidence you may not have been.
See, Andy doesn't understand how this thing is processed. Let me explain.
No one's as smart as you, Malcolm.
I haven't got the intellect that you've got, all the experience. Thanks a lot, Tony. You're the best journalist in Australia. God bless you. Well, you don't look like a chook to me, Tony. You look like a very skilled journalist and a very capable person.
I'm sorry.
I haven't made my point.
Every now and
well,
then,
I'm sorry. Why don't you shut up for a while and let me finish?
Every now and
why
then.
Don't you just keep quiet? Why don't you just keep quiet and let me finish what I'm saying? Every now and then. Come on.
Mr. Palmer, the audience has a right to know what's happening in legal cases against you.
But we've got a very important question to ask you before we begin, and that is, are you heretics?
Wait a minute, we have begun.
I was just feeling ashamed for you.
I know. Well, the terrible thing is that my main weapon was surprise, and you subverted it immediately.
Yeah. Very good.
So I think if I didn't have this part of me, you know, I mightn't be so nice. I might be a dick.
Thunderbolts and lightning, very, very frightening. Galileo, Galileo
Tonight on Lateline, I'm going to do my very first interview in virtual reality.
Tony Jones got a Mohican. Mm.
Hey Julian, how you going?
I had so much feedback over that debate between Malcolm Turnbull and Anthony Albanese in the 2013 election campaign on the NBN. We ended up running at about 27 minutes. And
Still a hot topic, that one.
And it's still a hot topic. And at the end of that debate between Anthony Albanese and Malcolm Turnbull, that had already gone on for 27 minutes, Malcolm Turnbull ushered us all out of the studio to a whiteboard that is outside this studio and continued to explain why the coalition's NBN, by way of diagrams on the whiteboard, was the optimum policy.
I've
rather Keating-esque.
I've had an explanation on that same whiteboard from Malcolm about the Murray-Darling River Basin.
Did you ever have any kind of disastrous moments or...?
The one that sticks in my memory was in the, what election campaign would have been, maybe 2007 it would have been. You know, we talked earlier about the time slot would always float depending on the previous programs, and it was a sort of source of great irritation because you'd spend a lot of time securing really good guests, and then, you know, you find yourself on at 10:45 p.m, and every 5 minutes at that time of night you'd losing audience. And so it was week one of the election campaign, and we're coming on at 10:45, and the show that started at 10:15 were reruns of like Summer Heights High or something, and I just thought, why not put that at 10:45 and we come on at 10:15? So I fired off an email to Kate Tawney, who was then the head of news, to make that point. And it was, you know, sort of 8 p.m. on a Friday night when I fired it off, thinking, well, you know, she'll get onto that next week. No, Kate Tawney, the model of efficiency, rings the head of television and has the program pulled forward half an hour from that very night. But all of the guests are locked in for live for 10:45 p.m. And so we then discover, sort of by shock, at about 9:30 that the show's now been brought forward by half an hour, and now we have nothing to fill it because nobody's coming in until 10:45.
Slip up.
I remember John Bruce, the executive producer, who's unflappable, totally unflappable, and never lost his cool. My phone rang, and I was just having a meltdown, thinking, "Oh my God,
Houston, we have a problem."
Yeah, and I pick up, and John says, "Lee, what do you think you're doing?"
We had a very similar story only just very recently where we were about to cross to someone. I was here in the studio ready to go live, and we were about to cross to someone, an expert somewhere in the world, I won't say where, and I just had very casually Jamie Cummins, my producer, in my ear say, "That interview won't be happening." And we were like 5 minutes before, and I said, "Why?" And he wouldn't tell me. And I just thought, what is going on? And I wasn't getting any answers. And
Guess he's tired and emotional.
He came down and said, "Because I've just spoken to him and he's very drunk. We can't put him on air." Did you have any tricky moments that you can remember?
Plenty. I had plenty. But I had one moment where I took a bit of a punt and it worked, and that was when I was interviewing Tim Fischer, who was Deputy Opposition Leader and Shadow Trade Minister. And it was Lateline, and I had him on his own. And there were a couple of tricky issues that he wasn't entirely across, which became increasingly obvious. One was NAFTA, the free trade agreement between the North American Free Trade Agreement, and the other he'd been sounding off about aviation policy. And on aviation policy, he started to founder, and he got to a point where he said, "Look, Kerry, I could go on, but I know that time is of the essence for you." So I said, deep breath, I said, "Take all the time you want."
Nice moment.
So I want to get your final reflections on what the program has meant for you, Kerry.
It's meant a great deal, and one of the best times in my life as a journalist, without a doubt. 28 years is a very long time for any program to survive on television, so it's a testament not only to the quality of the work that went into it and the effort, but to the importance of what it offered the audience. And you can fiddle with formats in a way, but when you look at the fundamental concepts that are going to fill a need with the broader community and that other television networks and other forms of media are not going to offer, always got to be careful not to throw baby out with bathwater, and I hope that at some point in the not too distant future that ABC management takes a good close look at those early years of Lateline, not just mine, Maxine's and others. Look at that format. Single issue topic, dealt with well, dealt with interestingly, and offering something to an audience, and ask themselves seriously whether it's really too much to take back on.
Maxine?
As for legacy, I don't know. It's too early. We'll have to wait and see. But look, I'd agree with Kerry. Among the most, professionally both challenging but satisfying times of my life, and I was thrilled that the ABC gave me the opportunity to do it. So I remain very grateful for that. I feel I had superb opportunities and was brilliantly supported by great set of people.
Lee?
I could not believe when I was asked, did I want to do it, given, the history of the program, and just the great pleasure of coming in every night to do it, and some of the people you could speak to, like great minds like Christopher Hitchens, or I used to love John Micklethwaite, who was the editor of The Economist, just these erudite, articulate, witty, interesting people that it was just, you just had to give the most gentle steer as an interviewer, and it was just such a pleasure to have those conversations about the most interesting issues in the world. So yeah, it has a very fond place in my career.
Well, thank you all so much. Lee Sales, Kerry O'Brien,
Emma.
Maxine McHugh.
And good luck to you, Emma.
Thank you. And that brings us to the end of our show tonight as we farewell an ABC icon. Thanks for your company these past 6 years. I'll miss this chair very, very much and the many privileges it's given me. Good night.